It began as an ordinary morning in Frederick, Colorado, the kind of morning where neighbors sip coffee on their porches, unaware that a quiet storm is already brewing behind someone else's closed doors. Hours later, the question would echo across the world. How could a family so full of life vanish without a trace? But before the headlines, before the heartbreak, there was a home filled with laughter, dreams, and the warmth of a young family who believed their future was secure. Shanann Watts was the kind of woman whose presence lingered even after she stepped out of her room, vibrant, determined, and endlessly devoted to her children. Friends described her as a fighter, someone who had rebuilt her life from hardship and poured her energy into creating a bright, nurturing world for her daughters, Bella and Celeste. 4-year-old Bella was gentle and cautious, always watching, always thinking. 3-year-old Celeste was fearless, spirited, the spark who brought motion to their little universe. And a new chapter was on the horizon. Shanann was pregnant with a baby boy, a child she had prayed for, planned for, and already loved deeply. To the outside world, the Watts family painted a picture of stability. Smiling photographs, birthday parties, family trips, carefully captured memories, all signs pointing toward a home where love was the center of gravity. And standing beside Shanann in those photos was her husband, Chris Watts, quiet and reserved, the type of man who rarely drew attention to himself. He presented as a dependable partner, the calm presence, the patient father, someone you would never look at twice and suspect of darkness. Yet behind closed doors, shadows had begun to form, subtle at first, easy to overlook. Financial strain pressed heavily on the family, the kind of stress that creeps into conversations late at night when the rest of the world is asleep. Chris seemed to withdraw, growing distant in ways Shanann struggled to understand. Their once-united partnership developed small fractures, the kind you don't notice until they widen beyond repair. Still, Shanann pushed forward with unwavering hope. She shared videos of her daughters singing, laughing, and playing, preserving every moment of their childhood with pride. She spoke excitedly about her unborn son, Nico, imagining the joy he would bring. Even when life grew complicated, she believed her family was worth fighting for. No one could have predicted how quickly that belief would be shattered. On the morning of August 13th, 2018, the world around the Watts home remained calm. Cars passed by, the sun rose steadily, and neighbors moved through their routines. But inside that house, something irreversible had already taken place. And when Shanann failed to answer messages, when she missed appointments she never would have ignored, an uneasy chill began creeping into the minds of those who loved her. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The disappearance of Shanann and her children wasn't just alarming. It was unimaginable. A mother who never left her children, girls who never wandered far from home, a family that was supposed to be safe. Within hours, concern turned into dread. Doors were knocked on, calls were made, and a quiet Colorado neighborhood braced for a discovery that would unravel the fragile illusion of normalcy forever. The bright, hopeful life the Watts family had once shown the world was gone. In its place was a void that begged a single haunting question. What happened inside that home before the sun came up? By midday on August 13th, the worry surrounding Shanann's silence had turned into something colder, heavier, a fear that settled in the chest like a stone. Friends who knew her routines knew her reliability even better. She was never unreachable, never absent without reason, and she would never, under any circumstance, let her daughters simply disappear. When a close friend arrived at the Watts home and found the house still, the car in the garage, and Shanann nowhere to be found, every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. A wellness check was requested, and soon police were standing at the front door, knocking, waiting, listening. The silence inside felt unnatural, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Moments later, Chris arrived, calm, composed, and strangely controlled for a man whose family was reportedly missing. He unlocked the door, guided officers inside, and moved the rooms with an unsettling stillness. Shanann's purse was there. Her phone was there. Her medications were untouched. Every object that a mother would take with her was still resting neatly in place. It was as if she had vanished mid-step, leaving behind a life frozen in time. And yet Chris insisted he had no idea where she or the children had gone. As word of the disappearance spread, Neighbors gathered outside in disbelief. The Watts home, once another quiet house in a peaceful cul-de-sac, became the center of a spiraling mystery. Friends described Shanann as a devoted mother who would never abandon her children. Others whispered about recent tensions, arguments, and the growing emotional distance between her and Chris. But even then, nobody was prepared to imagine the unthinkable. Chris appeared on camera that evening, pleading for their safe return. His words were steady, almost rehearsed, but behind his eyes there was something unreadable, a hollowness that unsettled those watching. While the public saw a husband begging for his family, investigators saw something else, a man whose story held too many gaps, too many inconsistencies. The search intensified. Officers retraced every step Shanann might have taken, questioned neighbors, reviewed security footage, and pressed Chris for clarity. The more they searched, the more unsettling the picture became. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry, no trace of the girls walking away. It was as though they simply ceased to exist. When investigators asked Chris to take a polygraph test, he agreed. It was a bold choice, or perhaps a desperate one. The results, however, shattered the facade he had maintained. The truth he was hiding began to seep through the cracks of his calm exterior. The lies could no longer hold. The story he crafted could no longer stand. Within hours, the investigation shifted dramatically. The missing persons case became something darker, heavier, the first steps toward uncovering a reality that would horrify the nation. The question was no longer where are Shanann and the children? It was, what has Chris been hiding all along? The moment the polygraph results were revealed, something in the atmosphere shifted. A subtle but undeniable collapse of the last barrier Chris Watts had been hiding behind. Investigators watched him closely, not with anger, but with the quiet, relentless patience of people who already sensed the truth. They pressed gently, methodically, allowing the silence between questions to do the heavy lifting. And in that silence, Chris began to unravel. His voice shook, his composure thinned. The carefully constructed image he had maintained, the calm husband, the confused father, the man pleading for help, began to dissolve right in front of them. What came next was not a sudden admission, but a slow leak of truth, forced out by pressure he could no longer bear. When investigators stepped out briefly and returned with Chris's father, the room took on a different weight. Sitting across from a man who raised him, who believed in him, who never imagined he could be capable of something monstrous, Chris finally cracked. Words spilled out in fragments, disjointed, halting, and shrouded in half-truths, but they were enough. Enough for investigators to understand that Shanann and the children were no longer missing. Enough to know that they were searching not for the living, but for the dead. Enough to realize that the man who had stood before cameras pleading for their return had already destroyed the family he claimed to love. Within hours of the confession, Chris was in the passenger seat of law enforcement's vehicle, guiding officers to a remote oil site owned by his employer. The landscape stretched out desolate and empty, the kind of place where secrets could sink into the earth and disappear forever. But on that day, with the world closing in on him, Chris could no longer hide the truth. There, in the aching quiet of the Colorado plains, investigators discovered what they had feared most. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, a young mother, a gentle daughter, a fearless daughter, and an unborn son who never took a breath outside the safety of his mother's womb. All gone, all taken by the very person who should have protected them above all else. The officers on site would later describe the discovery as something that stayed with them long after the case ended, a sight that settled deep into the conscience, impossible to forget. Even hardened investigators, accustomed to tragedy and loss, struggled with the weight of what they found. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was the end of the family, a betrayal of the most profound kind. Back in Frederick, news of the discovery spread quickly. Neighbors stood outside their homes in stunned silence. Friends collapsed into grief. Shanann's family, miles away, received the unimaginable confirmation that their daughter and grandchildren were gone. And the man responsible, the quiet husband, the devoted father, the one who insisted he knew nothing, was now in handcuffs, unable to hide behind lies anymore. The truth had emerged, but with it came even more haunting questions. Why had he done it? What darkness had grown inside him? unnoticed by the world. And how could someone so ordinary commit an act so extraordinary in its cruelty? As Chris was taken into custody, the world struggled to reconcile the smiling family photos with the horror that had unfolded. The duality of his character, the mask of normalcy versus the reality of what he had done, became the central point of the unfolding tragedy. For investigators, there was still more work to be done, more answers to uncover, more pieces of the puzzle to fit together. But one thing was clear. The man who had appeared as a loving husband and father had been hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And now, the world was about to learn just how deep that darkness went. In the days that followed Chris Watts' arrest, investigators, psychologists, and the public struggled to comprehend the enormity of what he had done. It wasn't just the act itself. It was a contradiction. How could a man with no history of violence suddenly annihilate the very people who trusted him most? How could someone who appeared so ordinary carry within him a darkness so absolute? Piece by piece, the puzzle began to come together. Behind the glossy family photos and the curated image of a peaceful home, the Watts family had been quietly crumbling. Financial strain loomed like a constant shadow, mounting debt, unpaid bills, and a lifestyle that stretched far beyond the reality of their bank account. It wasn't just stress, it was suffocating pressure. Responsibility weighed heavily on Chris, a man who rarely spoke about his emotions and struggled to articulate his fears. At the same time, a new secret had taken root. Chris had entered an affair, one he nurtured with growing intensity as he emotionally withdrew from his wife and children. To those studying the case, this was a turning point, a moment where fantasy and deception fused into something toxic. In that hidden relationship, he began imagining a life where his burdens disappeared, a life where he could reinvent himself, free of obligation, free of responsibility. To some experts, this hinted at a profound psychological fracture. Chris wasn't simply overwhelmed. He was compartmentalizing his world so drastically that he began to live inside a fantasy version of himself. In that imagined future, there was no debt, no conflict, no expectations, and no one to hold him accountable. Shanann, meanwhile, sensed a growing divide. Her messages, later revealed by investigators, showed a woman fighting desperately to save her marriage, clinging to hope even as the walls closed in. She believed the strain could be repaired. She believed the man she loved was still somewhere inside him. What she couldn't have known was that Chris had already drifted too far into his own manufactured escape. To psychologists, the case became a chilling study of duality, the ability of an ordinary man to mask a deteriorating mental landscape behind a calm exterior. Chris had mastered the art of quiet compliance, appearing gentle, patient, even passive. But beneath that surface lay unresolved resentment, emotional isolation, and a growing sense of entrapment that he never voiced aloud. Investigators began piecing together the why, but the answers felt disturbingly inadequate. Financial ruin, marital tension, a secret affair, a fragile ego. None of these explanations, even taken together, justified the destruction of an entire family. And yet, they were the broken stepping stones that led to a moment so catastrophic it defied all logic. The more experts studied him, the clearer it became. Chris Watts was not driven by a single motive, but by an accumulation of internal failures. His inability to confront conflict, his refusal to seek help, his desperate need to maintain a facade of control, his pursuit of a fantasy life where consequences didn't exist. In the end, what emerged was not a portrait of insanity, but a man who made a series of selfish, cowardly decisions that snowballed into an irreversible tragedy. But even with these revelations, the world continued to ask the haunting question: how does a father's heart turn so cold? How does a husband erase the very life he helped create? No psychological profile, no investigative report, no courtroom record could fully answer that. Some mysteries were too dark, too senseless, too deeply rooted in the hidden corners of the human mind to ever be understood. And as the truth of his motives came to light, a deeper, more painful story was unfolding outside the confines of the investigation. A story of grief, shock, and a community struggling to comprehend the unimaginable. As the truth settled over Frederick, Colorado, the weight of the tragedy rippled far beyond the yellow police tape and courtroom walls. The quiet suburban street where children once rode bicycles and neighbors waved from driveways became a place haunted by absence, a reminder that even the most ordinary homes can hold the darkest secrets. People walked slower, spoke softer, and looked at the Watts house with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief, as though it still echoed with the ghost of a life brutally cut short. For Shanann's family, the news shattered every sense of normalcy they had ever known. A daughter who had survived illness, heartbreak, and hardship, a woman who fought her way back into the light, was gone. Their grandchildren, whose laughter had once filled phone calls and family visits, were gone. And an unborn baby boy they had already begun to love, imagine, and name was gone before he ever opened his eyes. The grief was impossible to measure. It wasn't just loss. It was a violent rupture of a future. A lifetime of memories stolen in a single moment of betrayal. Friends struggled to navigate the sorrow, replaying conversations, messages, and small moments, wondering if they had missed some sign, some crack that hinted at the disaster to come. The community held vigils, lit candles, prayed, and wept together, each person trying to make sense of a senseless act. The names Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were repeated with reverence, spoken softly as though saying them too loudly might break the fragile calm holding people together. And yet, even amid this collective grief, something else lingered, a deeper, more unsettling question that refused to disappear. Could something have been done? Could someone have intervened? Were there signs hidden in plain sight that no one recognized until it was too late? Experts debated the psychological unraveling of Chris Watts, dissecting the choices that led to murders, searching for answers that might prevent future tragedies. But the truth remained painfully clear. The monster he became had worn the mask of an ordinary man so convincingly that even those closest to him never saw the darkness growing beneath the surface. The crime left no survivors in the physical sense, but the emotional survivors, parents, siblings, friends, and entire community, would carry the scars forever. They endured birthdays without candles, holidays without hugs, and milestones that would never arrive. Every memory became tinged with heartbreak. Every photograph a painful reminder of what was lost. Over time, the case became one of the most discussed tragedies in modern true crime, not because of its brutality, but because of its incomprehensibility. A husband who seemed mild and unassuming, a father who appeared loving, a family whose photos once looked picture perfect. It forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always come wearing a warning. Sometimes it hides behind familiarity. Years later, the lingering mysteries still remain. What was the exact moment Chris chose destruction? What thoughts drove him past the point of no return? Was there a sign no one recognized? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, why them? Why a family that loved him unconditionally? Those answers may never fully surface. Some truths are buried with the victims, leaving only fragments behind, enough to produce theories, but never enough to rebuild what was lost. What endures, however, is the memory of the victims, Shanann's determination, Bella's gentle curiosity, Celeste's fiery joy, baby Nico's promise of a life that never had the chance to begin. Their story lives on not because of the one who destroyed them, but because of the millions who refuse to let their names fade into silence. And as we close this heartbreaking chapter, let their story be more than a moment of sorrow. Let it be a reminder to cherish the people around us, to look deeper than appearances, and to speak up when something feels wrong, even in the smallest ways. If this story moved you, if it stirred questions or emotions you weren't expecting, I invite you to be part of the conversation. Share your thoughts, your theories, or your reflections in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your perspective might help someone see this case and the world through a different lens. If you want more true crime stories told with depth, compassion, and truth, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Each story we explore is a chance to honor victims, learn from tragedy, and understand the hidden layers of human nature. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for remembering. Until the next story, stay safe, stay aware, and hold your loved ones a little closer.